One peninsula, one nation, the same language, the same culture, the same families, just 75 years ago. Today, a border divides them that can't be crossed, not even for a moment. On one side, a country that manufactures smartphones used by half the world. On the other, a country that doesn't have enough power to light its own cities after dark. That difference is so vast you can see it from space. One half of the peninsula lit up like a giant living organism. The other, total darkness, except for one tiny point of light in the middle. How did one nation speaking one language end up living in two completely different centuries? September 2nd, 1945. Japan signs its formal surrender, ending 35 years of occupation in Korea. For millions of Koreans, this should have been a moment of liberation and unity. Instead, within a matter of hours, two American officers, without consulting a single Korean, pull out a map and draw a line along the 38th parallel. It was meant to be temporary, a boundary between occupation zones, until the great powers could agree on a single government for all of Korea. North of the line, the Soviet Union moves in. South of the line, the United States. But the world is entering the Cold War, and neither side has any intention of giving up its half. In the north, the Soviets install Kim Il-sung, a young communist who spent the war in the Soviet Union. In the south, the Americans back Syngman Rhee, a staunch anti-communist who spent decades in exile in the US. By 1948, the temporary line has become the border between two separate states, each with its own government, each claiming to represent the entire nation. Both leaders openly declare their intention to unify Korea, by force if necessary. A nation that had functioned as one culture for 1,000 years is torn apart by a line drawn in a single afternoon by men who had never set foot in Korea before. June the 25th, 1950. At dawn, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel. Kim Il-sung, with the full backing of Stalin and Mao Zedong, moves to unify Korea by force before the South can arm itself. The attack is overwhelming. Seoul falls within 3 days. Within a few weeks, North Korean forces control almost the entire peninsula. South Korean troops and their American allies are pinned into a tiny pocket of land around the city of Busan in the southeastern corner. On September the 15th, General Douglas MacArthur carries out one of the riskiest amphibious landings in military history, landing at Incheon, deep behind enemy lines, cutting off the North Korean army's supply routes. The tide of the war turns within days. UN and South Korean forces retake Seoul, then push north across the border, almost all the way to the Yalu River, the border with China. That's too much for Beijing. In October, hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers cross the border, pushing UN forces back south. The front line freezes close to the original dividing line, where it will remain for 2 more years of brutal, grinding stalemate. July the 27th, 1953, an armistice is signed, not a peace treaty. Technically, North Korea and South Korea are still at war today, 70 years later. Along the front line, a demilitarized zone is created. A strip of land roughly 4 kilometers wide, the most heavily mined and fortified border on Earth. A war that claimed, by some estimates, as many as 3 million lives, soldiers and civilians on both sides, ends almost exactly where it began. The border shifts by a few miles. Nothing else changes, except one thing. A division that was supposed to be temporary becomes permanent. 1953. Both Koreas emerge from the war in nearly identical poverty. Cities leveled, economies in ruins, millions of people without homes. From the outside, no one could have predicted which half of the peninsula would succeed. In the north, Kim Il-sung builds something more than a government. He builds a political religion. An ideology called Yuche preaches self-reliance, total independence from the rest of the world. By 1972, it's written directly into North Korea's new constitution as the country's official binding doctrine. In practice, it means isolation, control over every aspect of citizens' lives, and a cult of personality around Kim Il-sung himself, whose portraits hang in every home, every classroom, every office. In the south, the political situation is far from democratic either. Syngman Rhee rules as an authoritarian until he's overthrown in 1960. A year later, General Park Chung-hee seizes power in a military coup. Park rules with an iron fist for the next 18 years, but with a completely different goal than Kim Il-sung in the north. Instead of isolation, Park bets on exports. Instead of closing the country off, he opens it to trade with the Western world, with the full backing backing of the United States, for whom South Korea becomes a key ally against communism in the region. Two halves of the same nation, emerging from the same war, from the same poverty, begin heading in completely opposite directions. One closes its doors to the world, the other throws them wide open. The 1960s. South Korea is one of the poorest countries on Earth. Income per person lower than in many countries of sub-Saharan Africa. Park Chung-hee sets one goal above all others: industrialize the country, whatever the cost, including civil liberties. The government handpicks a small group of family-run companies and floods them with cheap credit, protection from foreign competition, and direct state support. These companies, known as chaebols, carry names the whole world knows today: Samsung, Hyundai, LG. They start out assembling wigs and cheap textiles for export. Within a decade, they've moved into steel, shipbuilding, automobiles. The economic growth is so explosive that economists will later call it the miracle on the Han River, named after the river running through Seoul. Between 1962 and 1990, South Korea's economy grows by an average of nearly 10% a year for almost 3 decades straight. But for a long time, that growth goes hand in hand with dictatorship. Park Chung-hee rules with an iron fist until 1979, when he's shot dead by the head of his own intelligence service. It isn't until the 1980s, after another wave of student and labor protests, that South Korea fully transitions to democracy. That transformation hasn't slowed down since. Samsung becomes one of the largest technology companies on Earth. Korean dramas, films, and music, K-pop, conquer global pop culture in a way no one could have predicted just one generation earlier. A country that lay in ruins in 1953 becomes one of the richest economies in the world. While the South climbs toward prosperity, the North closes itself off more and more tightly. For decades, Kim Il-sung keeps the country isolated, propped up by economic aid from the Soviet Union and China. It works, as long as the Soviet Union exists. 1991, the USSR collapses. The economic aid North Korea had relied on for 40 years disappears almost overnight. The country's already struggling agricultural system collapses completely. The mid-1990s bring a catastrophe the regime will euphemistically call the Arduous March. Famine ravages the country. According to international estimates, somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people die. The exact number remains unknown because the regime has never allowed independent observers in to count. In 1994, Kim Il-sung dies. Power passes to his son, Kim Jong-il, continuing the cult of personality now built around a new name. In 2011, power passes to a third generation, Kim Jong-un, grandson of the country's founder. The regime survives through a combination of absolute control over information, a network of labor camps for anyone suspected of disloyalty, and one bargaining chip with the rest of the world: nuclear weapons. North Korea conducts its first nuclear test in 2006. The program keeps advancing despite decades of international sanctions, because for the regime, nuclear weapons aren't optional. They're a guarantee of survival. While Seoul builds skyscrapers and exports its culture to the entire world, Pyongyang defends itself against time itself, quite literally frozen in decades the rest of the world left behind long ago. Today, the demilitarized zone still cuts the peninsula in two, the most heavily fortified border on Earth, a silent monument to a war that never officially ended. On one side of that line, South Korea, the world's 15th largest economy, a country exporting technology, music, and film to every corner of the globe. On the other, North Korea, one of the most isolated countries on Earth where ordinary citizens have no access to the internet, and the regime still pours the country's limited resources into nuclear weapons instead of food for its own people. It's still the same nation, the same language, still understood on both sides of the border despite decades of separation. The same family names, the same traditions from before the divide. Millions of families still remember relatives separated in 1950, many of whom died never knowing whether their loved ones on the other side of the line were even still alive. That same satellite image you saw at the start of this film is still true today. One half of the peninsula lit up, the other sunk in darkness. 75 years ago, two strangers drew a line on a map in a single afternoon. That line turned one nation into two worlds, living in completely different centuries. The question that remains, will that line ever disappear, or is Korea divided for good?